This is our final writers' room of this year, and we're delighted to have you all here this evening, so thank you very much for coming. Very pleased tonight to have the director Leanne Pooley and producer Matthew Metcalfe, and to have Toa Fraser chairing the discussion. So I'm going to throw over to Toa. You probably know Toa already as a playwright and of some amazing plays, and a writer-director of Number 2, director of Dean Spanley, a writer on River Queen, and has actually just been to Toronto himself with these guys with his own film Giselle. So thank you very much for being here tonight and welcome, and I'll throw to you to introduce these esteemed panellists.
My pleasure, Esther. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. We're just going to play the trailer, eh? Shall we do that before I introduce our esteemed friends Leanne Pooley and Matthew Metcalfe? So, yes, wonderful movie and very magical, and as I was saying to Nairi outside, we always say how moving it was. I felt really privileged to be there at one of the earliest screenings of Beyond the Edge. Directed by Leanne Pooley, who, as many of you may know, was born in Canada, but has lived in New Zealand for since the mid-80s, I believe, and is responsible for some of the most fantastic documentaries of our cinematic history, including Haunting Douglas, I believe was his first feature, and Shackleton's Captain, and of course the great Topp Twins movie. And my friend Matthew Metcalfe, who produced Beyond the Edge, is another of New Zealand's most talented persons, having produced many incredible movies, including Lovebirds, my film, our film, I should say, Dean Spanley. Nemesis Game, I believe, was your first feature, Matt. And what else have you done? Heaps.
Up to number 7, so...
It's pretty good going for a producer in New Zealand, pretty good record. So, listen, we are all friends. I should say that as a full disclosure, and hopefully it's not going to be too cozy up here. And I intend, hopefully, to turn that into an advantage and ask some indiscreet questions and hopefully get some, the real oil out of these guys. Having said that, my first question to you, Leanne, is a question that I know has been asked of you before, and I imagine you're very well prepared to answer this. Who got to the summit first?
It isn't actually, it's not really a controversy. Ed physically stood on the summit first, but we chose in the movie not to worry about that, not to make that the conversation. So for those of you who've seen the film, you'll know that the audience gets to the summit first ahead of them, so that you don't actually see who steps there first. And that was very much a conscious decision, because I didn't want that to be the conversation, because Ed didn't want that to be the conversation. Because most mountain climbers will argue that you do that climb as a team, and who sticks their foot on the summit first is a bit like, I don't know, who's the first orgasm? Who cares? If it's a couple, if it's a team effort, it's a team effort.
So when I said we were going to be indiscreet, I didn't mean it like that.
I've been on the radio a lot. I haven't never say anything on the radio.
We were friends, but not that close.
You know what I mean? It's a team effort.
It's a team effort.
You like South Park, don't you?
It's funny because I was going to save this one for later, but I might as well ask it now. The producer-director relationship is very important, and something that we all need to make work. And often it's a common situation where I'm personally asked, because Matt and I have done 2 movies together, and people often ask me, so you and Matthew Metcalfe, how does that work? Matt, you asked Leanne to do this film, so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you came to work together.
Look, every producer works a little different, and most of you will probably know I'm not a very good producer for hire. I kind of need to do my own projects that thus become our projects with someone else, and in the case of Beyond the Edge, I started off wanting to tell the story, and I had believed for a long time that the best way to tell the story, at least in my opinion, was a simple bottom to the top. Just as simple as that. And I always believed, just be in your window.
I like it. You tell a dirty joke at the beginning of the thing, and then from that point on, everything sounds grubby.
I'm trying to think now how to not twist the words, you know what I mean? Everything's got connotations now. But basically, I wanted to just tell this story of the conquest of Everest. I'm going to giggle when I say No, but I wanted to tell the story. I believed it was about the triumph of the human spirit. And in that regard, I always felt that the story was in much the same genre as Chariots of Fire or The World's Fastest Indian. That's what it was really about. The choice of director is obviously a tough one, and to be honest, you ask a lot of questions. None of these things happen fast, so you're working on it and you start asking around, and everyone just kept saying, Leanne, you've got to go speak to Leanne. And so then the name had come up half a dozen times, so I did some research, went to the DVD shop, watched some things, and yeah, I was really impressed with the work. But to tell the truth, I don't actually put that much stock on previous work. Believe it or not, it really comes down to the meeting. So I just sent Leanne an email. Was it a call? I think I just emailed Leanne, and we went and had a coffee on Ponsonby Road, because that's where filmmakers go, as you know. And I just said, I've got this idea, let's make a Hillary movie. Do you like the idea? And Leanne kind of just went, yeah. And then she said, let's make it in 3D. And then I knew she was hooked. So that was that. I can't actually think of, beyond that, it's just a gut call.
I was going to ask that because it was a TV idea originally?
What happened, Beyond the Edge was, as often happens in film, you have happy accidents. And originally there was a request for proposals with TVNZ. And I went and had a chat to them, and I said, well, maybe we could do Hillary. And there wasn't much interest. So I didn't really do much with it. And then...
they turned down the Topp Twins film too.
So I hadn't actually written anything at that stage. I had just, I just sort of felt like it would be a really cool thing to do. And then go back to, it would have been about April last year, and if some of you came to the Dean Spanley talk that Toa and I did, one of the things I said then was I woke up in the middle of the night and I decided that I just wanted to make Dean Spanley, and I kind of tore my house apart to find the script and make some notes. That's pretty much what happened with Beyond the Edge. I've been thinking about it for years, and then one day in early April, I believe, last year, I literally woke up and I was like, I have to write this down. And I literally sat down and I just started writing. And I wrote for about 4 days. And at the end of 4 days, I had sort of an outline of the story that focused on the storyline as it related to a cinematic arc. So there was a setup that related to the history of the time and where, what the bigger picture was. There was a first act turning point, which was, in my mind, Ed falling into the crevasse. There was a midpoint, the hero's lowest point in the journey, where Ed was told that it wasn't going to be him going to the summit, that it was actually going to be Bourdillon and Evans. There was a second act turning point where the story spun again and Bourdillon and Evans failed and the end was up. And there was a final challenge, which was the Hillary step. So I spent about 4 days writing that basic document down, and that was the document that I gave to Leanne.
And so, Leanne, it's a tricky thing when you've been asked to make a movie, knowing that if you agree to it, you're embarking on a big journey, a big chunk of your life. What got you across the line with this project?
Well, I mean, it's the Hillary story, isn't it? And any filmmaker gets an opportunity to make a feature film about something as important and such a great story. And I thought the document that Matthew gave me was the right way to approach it, although I thought we could do it in 3D. I thought that was a good idea. I think, that it made more sense to me than trying to cover Ed's entire life, all the wonderful things he did after this. It did make sense to me to concentrate on the part of the story that led to the other the other great things, you know, the building of the hospitals, all those other things. None of that happens at this moment, doesn't happen. So it did seem to me a really sensible way to tell the story, and it's such a great story. So I didn't actually think about it very long, I don't think. I think I said, yeah, at the meeting, really, didn't I?
Yeah.
But I'm quite impulsive. I'm an impulsive person.
We're going there again, Leanne. I was going to ask a serious question then, but I can't remember what it was because the word impulsive threw me. But I was going to, one of the things that I loved about it was that we didn't get a sort of, I don't know how to pronounce it, a hagiography. And, you know, I think even in the trailer there's mention of Ed Hillary's demons. I love that about the movie, and was that something that you particularly brought to the table with your approach?
Well, I just think that any story about a person is more affecting if we, the audience, can identify in some way with that person. And if somebody is a complete superhero, that sets them apart from the audience entirely, that makes it more difficult. And I think it's more interesting that Ed had to overcome his own demons, and that he was a little bit, you know, insecure and shy as well, but also very driven and very ambitious, and that those character traits, the juxtaposition of those character traits makes him interesting and complex, which is more interesting than just a two-dimensional superhero. So it was, I think in any film you want to see a little bit of the complexity.
And I loved, I hope I'm not giving too much away about the end, but I loved the moment when, you know, everybody knows the story, right? So they're on top of Everest at the end, and what's the line? I can't remember, about hugging.
What Ed says that he put out his hand to shake, you know, in classic Anglo-Saxon fashion, sort of put out his hand to shake Tenzing's hand, and this wasn't enough for Tenzing, who just sort of threw his arms around him and hugged him till they had no breath left, he said, which doesn't have to be that long when there's no air, but they hugged, and it's a lovely moment, yeah.
And then I know that you like even more, maybe the moment following that, when you go back to the original footage and they climb down the hill.
Yeah, I mean, those of you who've seen the film know that it intercuts between reconstructed material and original footage that was shot in 1953. And my favourite piece of original footage is they come off this mountain, and you've got to know John Hunt, the leader of the expedition, reasonably well over the course of the journey. And he comes racing up and hugs them all, and he is not a guy that hugs. This is not a hugging man. And actually, subsequently, I've read that he apologised profusely to Ed and Tenzing for hugging them. But it just shows all the kind of pressure and the tension that he carried, because if they fail, it's actually him that's blamed, not Ed and Tenzing. It would have been Hunt that carried the can, if you like. So yeah, I love that moment because it's just so out of his character to do that.
And one of the things that's beautiful about it is the original footage. Was it always the intention to mix the two, the original footage and the contemporary?
Look, I have to give full credit to Leanne for that. What I took to Leanne was really a screen story, was an approach. It was Leanne, and full credit to her, who came back to me and said, I think the way we should do this is we should intercut the original footage from the time with footage that we shoot. And it was a little bit of a leap of faith. Like it sounded. What often happens in film, as you know, is what can often sound far-fetched on the day can seem really obvious with hindsight. And I remember taking a moment to try to compute that and think how that would work. But it really worked, and it was a big leap for Leanne to do, to my mind, because it's a brave move, rather, is what I'm trying to say. You're putting a lot of pressure on yourself as a filmmaker to do that, because you're instantly narrowing your limitations. You're saying that everything will work by weaving in and out of something which already exists, which means that you're boxing yourself into a certain approach. But it really worked, and Leanne did so much research, and she was so prepared that she was able to go up onto the mountain under very tough conditions and literally know that not only did this shot have to cut with another shot, which, yeah, you know, is standard filmmaking, but she knew that it had to cut with a shot that was shot 60 years ago, that was graded a certain way, that was lit a certain way, that was going to be post-converted to 3D a certain way, which was framed a certain way, when you think about all those elements, that's quite a lot to sort of take into the shot, and it's in 3D.
We couldn't afford to shoot it all, and we couldn't afford to shoot the whole thing in drama, didn't we? We had to be creative with what we did in terms of, because if we had to shoot 90 minutes of drama, we would have had to do it in my garage.
And honestly, unfortunately, apparently filming above 10,000 feet is expensive. Who would have known? But it is.
What was the state of the footage when it came to you? Was it a challenge to? Was it ready to look at, or what?
It was actually a little bit disappointing because Matt had gone to the trouble of getting the original print transferred to.
Yeah, I arranged
4K.
for a 4K scan of the original print, and we were quite excited when that. You can buy The Conquest of Everest on DVD, so you could see the original footage on sort of a TV screen, but we needed cinema size. So I went to Shackleton Studios outside of London, where it's held, the master negative, and we had it retransferred, and we were quite excited when it arrived, but it was kind of rubbish.
Yeah, we were disappointed. It was really dirty and hadn't been stored particularly well. It was covered in scratches and half of it was out of focus. So Digital Post did an extraordinary. I mean, that had an impact on what we chose to use. Which sequences were better than others, but also Digital Post did an extraordinary job of cleaning that footage up. I mean, frame by frame, beautifully. But what was amazing were the 3,000 photographs, because the film also uses still photographs as well as the moving imagery from 1953. And the still photographs were amazing and beautiful and sharp and gorgeous. And so it meant we leaned on those maybe slightly harder than I imagined initially, but actually the still photographs go into 3D easier and better. So it ended up serving us in a funny sort of way.
And Grant Major was the production designer of the new stuff. I imagine there would have been a serious challenge, again with a limited budget, to match the existing footage to.
In order for the film to work, in order for this leap of faith to work, the archive material and my material, the detail has to be absolutely exact. And so both Grant Major and Barbara Darrow, who did costumes, just did the most amazing job. I mean, I'm talking buttons that match the buttons, and every stitch on the tents were the same kind of stitching, and just without that I can't intercut. And so they just, it was amazing. And I think it was, I don't like to talk about the budget very often, but I'm sure it was
We
challenging.
seem to be talking about it a lot. Putting Matthew under a bit of pressure there.
Look, it was really, really challenging. See, the thing is about filming Beyond the Edge is, other than what we called our quarry, which was our rain cover effectively, which was literally a converted quarry with a lot of green screen built around it. Everything else was shot above 10,000 feet, and above 10,000 feet, I used the word apparently again, no roads, no forward right access. The only way in is helicopters. And so we ended up needing to take approximately 3 tons of equipment, 30 people, and about 24 helicopter loads up and down a mountain every day. And it meant
It was really cool though.
it was doing right in the Valkyries. Like you did feel quite cool, like you have all these choppers coming in. You felt yourself saying, I love the smell of napalm in the morning, Very cool. Smell of jet fuel in the morning. And it was quite, I remember the first morning actually was very exciting because we got down there and we had to use every ounce of daylight. So you went down to the landing pad at pre-dawn, and so you would get there in the dark and all the helicopters would have their rotors whirring. So it was quite surreal movie kind of experience. You get down there and all you could hear was these turbines turning over and people walking around in shadows because it's dark and the landing lights of the helicopters are on. And then literally when nautical twilight was hit, so the first legal hour of daylight hit, you'd see one of the loadmasters literally go wind it up and the choppers would start turning.
I like how Matt's got all this technical jargon about helicopters.
It's good, eh? Well, I'm a producer. Big words.
You're a producer, it's because you like helicopters.
Man, it's embarrassing.
You've got to find movies to do that involve helicopters. Meanwhile, I was stuck in Bali land, you know. I've never even been in a helicopter.
I'm just going to say something here. My heart bleeds. It was tragic. Every day going to work with some of the most beautiful women in New Zealand wearing limited clothing. It was terrible.
We had no women. We didn't have a single woman on my show. I was the woman.
You were the woman.
What about Barbara?
Barbara and Karina, actually, yeah. But no women in the film.
True.
You were the woman. The casting, Chad Moffat, pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, Chad, I mean, you get extremely lucky. We were nervous. I was really nervous, actually, about the casting because obviously for this notion of mine to work, the intercutting, we really needed somebody who looked like Ed Hillary, and I needed somebody who looked like Tenzing Norgay, and so it was frightening to embark on that journey. And we did this nationwide casting call, and we had all these people come forward, and I mean, it was wonderful and hilarious and crazy. I mean, people wanted to be part of it. I think there was a sense that people they love Ed, so they wanted to be part of it in some way. So, I had one guy audition who was 5'5". I don't think he thought he was going to get the part, but he wanted to be in part of it.
And there was the guy who was about 55 with a beard gut out to here.
He actually arrived just after Chad. He just looked at me like this, But Chad, I needed someone who could come up with a performance as well, and so it was quite frightening, the notion of finding somebody who was looked a lot like Ed, and the wonderful thing about Chad, and I got quite excited about Chad the first time he read, and I had a hard time getting him out of my head, even though I saw a whole stack of people after Chad, because he was actually the first person who read, weirdly, is that he is actually quite Ed-like just in himself. He's a little bit shy and quite a sort of humble sort of guy, and he doesn't like me to use the word awkward, but he's a teensy bit awkward and a little bit like Ed in that way. Well, a lot like Ed, but he's also quite focused and driven, also like Ed. So I just felt, and his parents are beekeepers. Go figure. And Tenzing we saw in a restaurant in Mount Cook, which is sort of like a Hollywood moment across the room. I just went, oh, look, that man looks like
So you
Tenzing.
were in Mount Cook, and you were already filming then, or no?
We were on a recce. So we were down there location hunting, and there's a Sherpa community that lives around Mount Cook that are actually in New Zealand because of Ed Hillary. They come here because of that connection. And Sonam was working in the restaurant, and literally I just went, somebody get that man.
Somebody get that man. Interesting. So Chad Moffat, right? He wasn't born here. Or was he born here?
He was born in Canada.
He was born in Canada, right? Because I'm going somewhere with this. So he was born in Canada. You were born in Canada. Were you born here?
Yeah, Christchurch.
So that totally stuffs up my question, because I thought you were born in Australia. Anyway, my question is,
Chad got here when he was 18.
Leanne, because I was born in England too. I was born in England. I was born outside New Zealand. Is there something about the fact, you have done some of the most iconic, you've told stories about some of the most iconic New Zealanders, and is there something about the fact that you can see New Zealand through an insider-outsider perspective that helps?
It's hard for me to know for sure. I do think I probably have a slightly different perspective on some of it. Maybe I'm not as intimidated by it as well, because I'm not smart enough to be intimidated by it. But maybe it's hard for me to know. I've been here much longer than I've lived anywhere else. So, and I had my children here, and I think once you start breeding somewhere, you feel that you're there. But possibly, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. People mention it. I think what happens too, though, is you do one big thing, and it leads to another big thing. So I'm not sure if it's that I'm an outsider or not. I'm not sure.
Intriguing. I say. So listen, you talked about Mount Cook. Did you guys go to Everest or what?
No, it was
The film went to Everest.
The film went to Everest, but I was really disappointed because I had, as Toa correctly outed me on, I do quite like to do projects where I get to do exciting things, and one of the things that happened when we started getting this film off the ground was like, well, someone's going to have to go to Everest, and I was like, well, okay, I'll go. Okay, I'll do it. I'll go, and then it was kind of like I'll go to base camp. Then it was like I'll go through the Kumbo Icefall and I'll go to the Loti Face. And I was getting quite excited about this, and then, as things would have it, my wife calls me up and says, we're having a baby. And it's due right when you're going to go to Everest. And I do confess that I kind of held on to this, because my wife was really cool about it. She's like, you should still go to Everest. And I think for about 3 months...
She didn't mean that though for a minute.
Well, no, I think both of us meant it, because both of us had no idea what was coming. And it seemed like it seemed workable, like I'd go to Everest, she'd have the baby, I'd come back, it'd be fine. No. So within a short amount of time, I realised that was not going to be a starter. And we instead sent people there who were qualified to be there and could actually be useful.
Because I actually said from day one, well not day one, as soon as I started doing the research, I'm not going to Everest.
And I said to her, no, we can go, it'll be cool.
I was reading and watching every documentary ever made about Everest, and I know that 1 in 45 die. And I know that...
That's why you look at things. She goes 1 in 45 die, and I go, yeah, but 44 live.
And that your chances of dying increase exponentially over the age may be, and all those sorts of things added
Would you
up.
say it's beyond the edge at a certain point?
So I wasn't going to Everest, but we did send the wonderful Mark Betu, and he had a book of what we did is we sent him last. So we did all the shooting, we did all the interviews, we did a big, what we called an animatic, but it was almost a rough cut of the film, and just left gaps where I knew I needed Everest material. And then we sent Mark, and he had a book of 40 pages of storyboards. So it was like, I need you to hang over the Southeast Ridge, if you don't mind, you know. and it would have been pointless for me to be there, because I couldn't, I would have been a liability, without question. And 1 in 45 died.
Well, he didn't go up there alone, did he?
He summited, but he had a party of Sherpas supporting him, and he was part of an expedition that was there doing other things as well. But he was there specifically working for us.
The bit that I loved was we spent a long time negotiating to see whether we could have helicopter aerials on Everest proper, and the cost was just off the dial, and we couldn't have it. And then I get this, so I've just accepted we're not going to have any helicopters, and we were really gutted about this. And then I get this phone call, you know, when sort of it was like the middle of the night or something, and it's just like, can you approve $5,000 for helicopters right now? And I was like, what? And it was just like, don't argue, can you approve $5,000 for helicopters right now? And I was like, okay. And then the phone was dead. I didn't even know what it was about. And then I found out afterwards that Mark, the cameraman, this is only New Zealanders do this, had run into a mate of his who had flown a helicopter on someone else's dime up to base camp, and they got on the booze together, and the guy said, if you can get $5,000 to cover the gas, I'll bury the flight time in the log somehow. And so that was the phone call I got in the middle of the night wanting to authorise the $5,000. And then when the helicopter wasn't meant to be flying, they just got up in it, and he hung out the side with some bungee cords and filmed all of the aerials that way.
And we're talking 8,000 meters and freezing cold, hanging out the door of a helicopter at 8,000 meters is, well, I don't think they flew at 8,000 meters, but it was high. There's no air. You can't hold a helicopter up at 8,000 meters. But it was, he couldn't see, the viewfinder's frozen. The opening shot of the film, it's unbelievable, it's my favourite shot of the film, is an aerial that Mark shot without being able to see.
Wow.
What, I don't know if anybody's interested in this, but I am. What camera did you use for that? Because there must have been light to be hanging out the side of the helicopter.
We used the C300, the Canon C300 in Everest. Yes, we did.
Yeah.
Actually,
We
you
didn't
did.
shoot the whole film on the C300, but
Right.
the Everest.
We took a C300 and a 5D to the summit, I believe.
What? I'm interested. What else? What other camera did you use?
Well, the reconstructions were shot on the Red Epic. And we basically had Peter Jackson's camera, which 3D kit, which he'd spent the last 2 years ironing out all little glitches in 3D. So we were really lucky because we had this kit that my crew who'd all come off The Hobbit, so Richard Black and Sean Kelly and Dean and Garth, the whole camera team had literally spent 2 years in 3D land with this kit, and so they knew it like the back of their hand, and that was a real gift.
I don't know anything about shooting with 3D. So do you guys all have to wear like 3D glasses?
Not when you're shooting, but we wore 3D glasses in the edit suite.
Right.
Yeah, we cut in 3D.
All the time?
Not all the time, but a lot of the time. I can't, probably half the time, yeah.
I mean, one of the most moving aspects of the movie is David Long's soundtrack. Tell us a little bit about that man and working with him.
I love David Long. And he wrote 83 minutes of music for this film. It's extraordinary what he's achieved. And I've worked with David before on 2 other films. And he did a great job on those films too. But I really think David has achieved something quite special on Beyond the Edge. I think, I joke that without David, it's, 2 guys wandering about in the snow. Not exactly, but it really does. It's a bit like, Jaws is a fish till you stick that doo-doo-doo on it. So it really, really, you know what I mean? It just was so important that, and because there's so much music, the score becomes part of the narration, if you like. And so it was really important that it did that without editorializing to the point where the audience was being beaten up by it. So it was a tricky line to try and walk between having the music play such a big part in the film without the audience feeling berated by the music. And I think David did something extraordinary. And we have a lovely working relationship. David and Tim Woodhouse and I have worked together. The 3 of us have done the other films together, and we to and fro the whole time. So I don't just send David a cut and get a score back. We do it scene by scene, and it's a really, really wonderful way to work.
And you mentioned Tim Woodhouse, the editor. You've worked with him a lot of times.
Yeah, we're just starting our 9th film together.
Oh yeah? What's that?
Can't say.
Oh. So you guys
But yeah.
You guys went to Toronto and had the international premiere there. And that's right, no?
Yes.
And that must have been a very fulfilling thing to bring a New Zealand story like this to the world stage.
What was really cool at the world premiere was we showed it at the Bell Lightbox, which is sort of the home of the Toronto Film Festival, and we had Peter Hillary and Norbert Tenzing, so their respective sons, in the audience, but the audience didn't know this. And so at the end of the film, everyone goes up on stage, and Leanne and I are up there with Norbu and Peter, and all of a sudden, like literally about 100 people start rushing forward to the stage at the end of the film with cameras and autograph books. And I'm personally feeling a bit chuffed, thinking, oh, awesome. I might sign an autograph, I'm quite popular. Yeah, feeling quite good. I'm just like brushed aside like a fly, and everyone goes straight for Peter and Norbu.
I signed 1 or 2. Just kidding. No, it was amazing. And a lot of those people were Nepali. There was a big Nepali contingent that came that night. Well, there was, of the 700 people or whatever, there was probably 60 Nepali people. And it was really special, I think, for Norbu too, because I think there's been a sense that his father hasn't been recognised maybe the way he should have been over the years. And I think Norbu felt that the film did recognise him. And that obviously the Nepali people felt that too. And it was really lovely.
And you, runner-up for the Audience Award, am I right in saying that, Matt?
Yes, Leanne, podium finish again. Leanne,
that's awesome. You got to say, on the world stage.
Yeah, it's all Leanne there. Leanne, she won last time with the Topp Twins, and we were runner-up with Beyond the Edge this time. I just don't know how often that happens, but I think that's big up for Leanne.
And it opened in New Zealand, how many weeks ago? 2 weeks ago. Your biggest fan, John Key, was at the premiere, Matt?
No, it opened last week.
Last week.
Haven't even been up for a week yet. No, we were, in fact, we got the news today. We were quite delighted. I've learned as a producer to lower my expectations, and it's best that way. And I got a call this afternoon, an email rather, saying that we had done better than I hoped, that we had the biggest ever opening for a documentary ever in New Zealand history. We had overtaken Fahrenheit 9/11, the Topp Twins, which was the previous record holder. We'd overtaken that, and we were the strongest opening New Zealand film of the last 18 months. So it was a nice afternoon.
Not that it's a competition and, you know, it's all numbers. It's an awesome movie too, but that's fantastic. So, listen, I'm running out of things to ask, and I'm sure that you have far more interesting questions to pose out there in the dark. So, what do you guys want to ask these esteemed panelists? Who has got a question? There is somebody at the back with a hat on, I think. Is that a hat? No.
What made you decide to go with the 3D? Because you seemed very persistent on it from the start.
Well, when you're telling a story that everyone knows the ending of, you have to make the journey worth it. And I hoped that in making the journey interesting and exciting, it would have an impact on the ending that everyone knew. And so I felt that that 3D would serve the story, that it would make it more experiential. I wanted the audience to feel like they were going on the journey with Ed and Tenzing, that they were part of this journey, so that when they got to the summit, they could feel proud too. And so it was about making it experiential, and I felt that 3D would do that. Also, you know, how many of us are going to be on Everest anytime soon? So, you know, I made the point of not going. That's right. So, you know, it's also giving people the opportunity to step into that environment. I mean, our 3D is reasonably gentle, I think, as 3D goes, those of you who've seen it. It's not about hurling, you know, shit off the screen. It's about pulling you into the environment, and that was sort of the theory early on.
Do you want to tell us about the turning the archive into 3D? Is it just going to a machine or something?
No.
Takes a long time?
I mean, it varied. There's a whole bunch of different ways to do that. Sometimes there's a process you can apply to it, but often it's frame by frame. It's slow and it's expensive. Particularly when your archive is 4:3, you have to make it 16:9, and you know, there's a whole stack of things. It was, again, DigiPost worked miracles. It's you know, sometimes you can add things to it to give it another layer. You can push part of it back. You cut things out and move them about. It's really slow and expensive, and it's easier with the stills, which is one of the reasons the stills play a big part of the film, because obviously a still is one frame, and one frame that might last for 10 seconds rather than, you know, 10 times 25 frames. So that's why I think we did a little bit more sometimes with the stills than we did on the other archive, because it was so complicated to make the other archive 3D.
Could you have done it if Peter Jackson had not done 3D yet? Without Peter Jackson?
The archive, no, that had nothing to do with Peter Jackson. That was all DigiPost. So the archive and the still. Sorry?
DigiPost entirely, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So are the 3D cameras big and heavy to lug up the mountain?
It's not a compact creature, but it's not as big as it used to be. I mean, there's a whole stack of handheld stuff in the film. It's two cameras.
Yeah, it's just not the camera rig that's the problem with 3D. It's in our case, 1 ton of supporting equipment that goes behind the camera. That's the heavy stuff. You have this entire. It's about the size of a. Have you ever seen what sort of been at the airport and seen what they load into the side of 747? So those big aluminium bins. That's about what we took up each morning, and that would be stacked full of camera equipment, and that'd be unloaded, and then what remained in there would become kind of the camera command post for the day, and you need all of that.
There's a whole new creative person on your crew, the stereographer. It's like a new art form, really. And Sean Kelly, who was our stereographer, sits in like a little cave. We'd forget Sean was there, actually. He'd be in like a cave all day with all this gear. He's actually kind of, I don't know how you describe it, steering the 3D, if you like. He's making decisions while you're shooting about how deep the shot's going to be and where your convergence is and blah, 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 which you can change in post, but it makes a big difference if the guy you've got driving that separately to what the cameraman's doing, the DOP's doing. So there's sort of a whole chunk of stuff that goes on. But the camera itself is really 2 cameras in a rig. And as I say, some of this is handheld. So it's heavy and cumbersome, but not as heavy and cumbersome as you might imagine. There's somebody over there had their hand up before.
Sir, back there, you put your hand up a few times.
Oh, yeah, thanks. I was wondering how high up the mountain does the original footage go? And who shot it?
The original footage goes to the South Col, which is about 26,000 feet. And most of the footage at that height, everything above the Lhotse face, which is, have you seen the film?
I have actually, yeah.
Okay, so everything above Advanced Base Camp 4, so from the Lhotse face up, bottom of the Lhotse face up, is all shot by George Lowe, who's the other New Zealander on the expedition. George shot all that footage. All the footage of Evans and Bourdillon coming down and all that, that was all George Lowe. So, and on the film that was released in 1954, George was credited as the cameraman. There was a cameraman, a specific cameraman on the expedition, but he suffered from altitude sickness and couldn't get any higher than the Lhotse face.
Just a question about the structure of the film. The script, it's a linear form. Did you change, came up with the idea of following the linear form from the beginning. Did that change much through the editing? Process of, did structurally, dramatically, that alter?
Not hugely in the sense that, we went from the bottom of the mountain to the top. We mucked around with, those little breakouts of going to the past and rah. So that kind of, we needed those for punctuation and relief, I guess, from that linear structure. What changed most really is we lost stuff. We would pare things out. There was a whole backstory about how Hunt got to be the leader of the expedition because he wasn't the original leader and the original leader got fired and rah, which we just lost because we didn't feel it kind of mattered in the end. So it was more about things coming out, but the bottom to the top sort of stayed the same. It's just the actual punctuation moved around.
How did you do for sales in Toronto?
We did very well. We did a huge, none of these have been announced yet, but I don't mind saying them. We did a huge theatrical sale to Japan, the first New Zealand film that sold to Japan theatrically since The World's Fastest Indian. There were also sales, I can talk about the ones that are about to be announced. The ones that are about to be announced are Japan, big theatrical to Germany, big theatrical to the United Kingdom, big theatrical to the Middle East, and big theatrical to, I'm missing a territory in there somewhere. I can't remember. The other ones are still in negotiations, so I can't say.
What was the budget?
You're asking the wrong producer. If you want to find out the budget of the movie.
Must be on public record.
No, not as much as I would have liked.
Is there a trick of the trade with the budget? It looks like a very complex thing to work out. You've got to, make sure you've got enough money to start.
But you never have enough
Lines
money.
in there.
There's the trick right there. You never have enough money. That's
I
for
agree.
sure.
You never have enough money, and you could run a whole bachelor's degree in financing films. That's a dark alchemic science all of itself.
And it does rely on the goodwill often. Matthew did an amazing job and raised, a budget that I was thrilled to have, but it also relies on the goodwill of the people you're working with, DigiPost, and everybody on a New Zealand production. We had people donating crampons, the old 1953 crampons, because it's really expensive to try and remake those crampons if you have to have them. Well, we had some made, but we got given some from Alpine clubs, and Grant Major did a brilliant job of sort of sourcing ISAC. So there's a lot of goodwill too in a New Zealand production.
Well, that applies to any New Zealand production. It's virtually, on a New Zealand production, you will, virtually without exception, never have enough money to use money to buy your way out of problems. You will always have to solve problems by thinking outside the box, because you will never have, on a domestic production, $100 million where you can say, here's $500,000, go and solve it. It's just never going to happen.
And I made it slightly harder we made it slightly harder for ourselves in a way by making the decision not to use the talking head interviews ever. Because that's the cheapest part of the documentary, is cutting to somebody an interview. That's a cheap shot, a cheap moment for you. It takes up screen time. And when we made a decision not to do that, that's probably you're looking at 15% of your film. That's now 15% of the film you have to fill with pictures. You know, things like that, where Matthew just kind of sailed over those challenges, but it was challenging.
Question, Leanne, compared with when you put a theatrical release out for the Topp Twins, has the fact that the sort of screening mechanisms have changed since then, I presume, does that mean that you're able to sort of reach more people faster?
That's actually more a Matthew question. Topp Twins was released on film, so the print costs more money, which I'm assuming has an impact on how many theatres, so you would know better.
No, New Zealand has now virtually switched over to 100% digital. 35mm virtually no longer exists in New Zealand. There's only a couple of theatres in the provinces that still use it. So Beyond the Edge was the first film I've ever done that was 100% DCP or digital cinema print. And New Zealand is now is effectively a 100% digital cinema print country now.
Does that make it easier for us to do big release?
No, not really. It doesn't really make that much of a difference at the end of the day, because you can't force a film on an audience. An audience is either going to watch it or they're not going to watch it. Whether it's on 35mm or DCP, it won't make any difference. You know, the audience have to engage with it. It's like storytelling. You know, whether you're reading a book on a Kindle or on an old Penguin paperback, you've got to engage with the story no matter how it's presented.
But presumably you can have it out simultaneously in more venues than you would have done in the past.
Yes, I guess so, yes.
It's quite a tricky thing to figure out the optimum number for a movie. You don't want it to go onto too many screens because it would dilute the impact. You don't want it to go on too few screens. So I guess it's less about the technology and more about how you want to position the film.
Well, I see where you're going, but the reality is, of course, is that everyone's in this game equally because we get to go on DCP, but so does every other film in New Zealand going out at the same time. So at the end of the day, you're all still competing for the same screens, and you're not really offering anything new because everyone else is on a DCP as well. I think it does help because I can definitely tell you that it's cheaper, but as I was saying, conversely, it's cheaper for everyone else as well. So I don't think the balance of competition ultimately changes because of it.
What's the ratio of 2D screenings versus 3D screenings? Because presumably people, only certain cinemas have capacity to do 3D.
I don't know. I feel like I'm told it's about a third, but
Because I was trying to find 3D and there was a lot more 2Ds than 3Ds.
Keep trying.
I did. I found 3D.
I'm encouraging people to try and see it if they can on 3D.
Yeah.
And make sure it's loud enough. If it's a little too quiet, go out to the projectionist and say, Dolby number 7, please.
I'm a little neurotic about the fact that New Zealand cinemas refuse to play things very loud. But
No,
it's
you
my
need
own
to get Dolby
neurosis.
7 there.
This is a very small, picky question about, you're talking about the crampons and so on. Now, it seemed to me that the guy who played Sir Ed was wearing what I know as a stringlet and you know, like his vest, a sort of open weave. I was thinking, were they around in 1950?
If he was wearing it, they were around. Barbara matched every single costume to a photograph, so there's no way she would have him wearing it if she didn't see him wearing it in a photograph. Every single thread was
I thought
matched.
that must be the case, but I thought they were cotton. And I thought, why would you wear cotton?
If he was wearing it, it's accurate.
Right.
Fascinating that there's so much jargon involved in the costumes. Crampons. Good on Caesar salad.
Croutons.
I've been here all night.
Can you talk briefly about making a film of a story that everyone knows in terms of the narrative tools that you use? Like, it must be quite different in terms of hooking an audience in.
Well, I mean, that was one of the things I wanted to try and do was make it experiential. And make people feel part of the journey. The other thing is to try and give you enough information so that you are are interested in the sort of geeky stuff. I mean, it's interesting. That's sometimes quite tricky to get the balance too. There's information about the closed and open circuit oxygen. And, some people said, oh, you don't need that. And then other people said, no, please don't lose that. So it's trying to find the balance between geeky information and stuff that makes people interested and fascinated about just what it was like back then. So, and people say everybody knows the story. Everybody knows the ending. Actually, not that many people know the story. I personally didn't know there were 600 people heading off at the beginning. I didn't know that Ed wasn't the first choice to head for the summit. I didn't know that, that it wasn't a given that he would even get a shot. There's a lot of things we don't know. So to make it interesting, you have to make sure that that's rolling out so that you're grabbing people. And hopefully you're telling the story with tension and enough emotion and the drama. Just like, to be honest with you, it's no different than telling any other story. You still have to hit those key moments. You still do want a shift here, and you don't want it to all be one note. You need highs and lows. You need humor, which is often difficult in documentary. All those same things that you need in any film, be it documentary, be it fiction, be it a story everyone knows or a story no one knows. You still need to hit all those marks. It's exactly the same.
That's what I was talking about before in terms of the structural points. One of the things that Beyond the Edge does so well, I feel, is that despite, as we all rightly know, the outcome, it hits all the structural marks. There is a first act turning point, there is a midpoint, there is a second act turning point, there is a final confrontation. You go on a proper sort of hero's journey, if you will, and it gives you all of those kind of twists in the tail, which are necessary for good narrative storytelling.
And you have to have a hero that people care about, like any film. You want people to identify with your hero. And I've made films in the past where the hero isn't that likable. It's a lot easier if they're likable. And Ed's a likable guy, and Tenzing's an amazing guy, and so that makes it easier too. So also, you can't underestimate the New Zealand connection to the story in this market. I mean, a couple of the reviewers have commented on that. They are part of the story because it's in their DNA. And so I did mercilessly try and exploit that. I mean, literally, there is a thing in the film that goes, beautiful New Zealand. I mean, I was shameless in looking for that, yeah.
Shameless. Shameless. Does anybody else have a question?
Down the back.
Just a Matthew question. Will you do a 3D Blu-ray release of it?
I really hope so. And I thank you for that question, because that is going to prompt me to ask our distributor, but I'm going to assume so. So I'm going to give a tentative yes, albeit going out on a limb, but a tentative yes.
Sorry, what was that question?
The question was, is there going to be a 3D Blu-ray release?
And my answer was, I certainly hope so. So tentative, supportive yes from me, with the caveat that it's not really in my control.
There's a check at that.
Yeah, at the back, sir.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because you talk about it as a narrative, and obviously you've approached it as even if it was a fiction item. Did you approach it, or did you view it as more of a documentary or dramatic things? Did you ever worry about sort of getting more heavily?
I think that's a really good question, because you're touching on something that Leanne and I debated and discussed enormously, but one thing we agreed on pretty much from the get-go was that the word documentary was not going to be applied to this film. We were just going to make a film. Now, it's not to say that the end result isn't a documentary, but we have the same sales agent that Touching the Void had, and one of the things that he talked to us about was that when Touching the Void was made, they assiduously avoided using the word documentary. They just wanted it to be a movie in its own right. And we took the same approach as this. We all the time we would say, it's a movie. We're just telling a story of the conquest of Everest by Ed and Tenzing, and that's what we're doing. And I think that's been a really important part of the process, to just focus on it's a movie, we're telling a story. It's a good question.
In light of what you just said, did you contemplate at any stage doing the whole thing as a reconstruction rather than cutting back and forward with real shots?
No. We didn't. No, we wouldn't have had the money to do it. I mean, it's a whole other kettle of fish, to be honest. It's a whole other... Kettlefish. If we do the whole thing as a narrative drama, we didn't really, did we?
No, that would have been economically unviable.
I mean, there was no dialogue from the contemporary shoot, but I don't really remember that there was no dialogue. You know, it was a compliment to the filmmaking, I guess.
We took the decision not to have dialogue, partly because dialogue in documentary drama, reconstruction things can be clunky, but also I wanted Ed's voice and John Hunt's voice and George Lowe's voice. I want the voices of the people who've been to Everest to be telling the story so that you were kind of hearing it from the horse's mouth, and I wanted people to forget that Chad wasn't Ed, you know, and so in hearing Ed's voice telling us what was happening, or John Hunt's voice, and then some of the modern people. I had to get, at one stage we did discuss not using anybody who wasn't on the 1953 expedition. We thought we'll just tell the whole story with the guys that were there, which we could have done. It's just that they're all like this, they're all like, yeah, it was quite hard. They're also kind of understated, that sort of British thing. They don't like to talk with too much emotion. So we did need, in the end, I did a whole series of interviews with people like Stephen Venables, who's the first British person to summit without oxygen, and because he could talk slightly more emotionally. He's a New Age guy. And even Jim Whittaker, who is the first American to summit Everest, who summited in 1963 because he's American, you know, was able to express himself slightly more enthusiastically. And, you know, he's the one that said, you know, you'd have to be crazy to go to Khumbu Icefall. You're crazy to, you know, Ed was never going to say that kind of stuff. So we worked out that we were going to have to spice it up a bit with some modern observations as well. But I don't miss the dialogue, and I hope people don't.
Look, I actually think that one of the genius things that Leanne and Tim did, and it's easy to underestimate when you see the film just what these guys have done, in that there's no talking heads in Beyond the Edge, as those of you who've seen the film will know, and it's entirely narrated, as Leanne said, by people who were there, with a couple of, you know, ring-ins that have been dispersed to fill in the information. But those interviews, what that narrative soundtrack, if you will, has literally been cut from thousands of interviews. So Leanne and Kieran, our researcher, and Tim had to go through literally thousands and thousands of hours of interviews to trim it down and find the best statements on each thing, right down to the trim 93 minutes we've got now. I think it was a really remarkable achievement.
And Kieran, my researcher, I mean, you can't, on a film like this, underestimate the impact of that job. I mean, if there's an interview out there that Ed did that I haven't heard, I'll be, you know, astounded, because I think I've heard every interview. I mean, the first time you hear Ed's voice in the film, we haven't showed any clips anyway. The first time you hear Ed's voice in the film is an interview he did before he went to Everest. So it's an interview he did when he was nobody. He was a beekeeper. And how she managed to track that interview down is extraordinary, because he was just a guy at that stage. You know, he was just some guy.
Did you know that though when you did the interviews? Or did you go to the interviews and write it all up, and did you know that you weren't going to use any pictures?
I didn't shoot it for pictures. I called it a research interview at the time, but I tried to make sure I actually did all those interviews by myself, and so we were calling those research interviews. So we didn't shoot it to use it in the film, but we had sort of discussed the potential that if we were going to have talking heads, I'd have to go back and re-interview people, which we never had the money to do, so thank God we didn't have to do that.
There's another question there from that man.
Had Chad done any acting before, and if not, did you have to kind of trick him like you often have to do with non-actors?
No, he works in the film industry. He's a director. He's done acting classes, and he's done a little bit of acting in short films and extra work. He's an extra in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and so he's very comfortable. He knows the world really well. I didn't ever feel like I had to trick him, actually, and he became more and more comfortable as the shoot went on. Sonam was less experienced, and so with Sonam it was a little bit different, the way I approached what I was doing with Sonam. I wouldn't say trick him so much, but I almost exploited, in a way, his naivety, because it comes across as a lovely sort of honesty, I think, with him. But no, I don't think I had to trick either of them, really.
exploiting is nicer than tricking.
Leanne, did Chad want to be, does he want to be an actor, or was he just drawn to the fact he looked at himself and said, I look like Ed and I'll go for this because it's iconic?
I think he'd be keen to do more. I'm not quite sure if at the time what his goals were, but I know that he did enjoy it and he quite liked to do it. He's told me once he's really keen to be a villain. You know anyone looking for a villain? Chad's looking for a role.
Did you have a little cameo role, Matthew? That's where your name was written.
Oh, look, pretty demanding role. Obviously, I was doing some pretty dangerous knitting. It's quite dangerous there. Sewing, sorry. That needle was very sharp.
I did get to drop a boulder on my producer though. You know the scene where the boulder falls down and almost knocks somebody? That was Matthew. That was the director trying to kill the
No, it was so funny. When my wife saw the film in Toronto, and I said to her after the film, she said, I saw it, and I said, did you see me jump out of the way of the boulder? And I thought she was going to lean in and go, oh, awesome. She does this. She thumped me in the arm, and she says, fuck you, don't ever do that again. And she goes, I was pregnant, goddamn having our child, and you were playing stunts. Don't ever do that again.
It was styrofoam though.
No, don't talk about it. Styrofoam can be dangerous. I reckon that lump of styrofoam could have weighed possibly 1.5 kilograms. Seriously, dangerous.
Does anybody else have any more questions? There's a question right up the back there.
Can we have a clip?
Oh yeah.
Good idea. Let's have a clip and let's call it quits after that.
Should we do
That's our show, everybody. So give more of a round of applause to the producer and the director of Beyond the Edge, Matthew Metcalfe, and Leanne Pooley. And just important to know, what did you paint first? Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Just hang on. I have to thank the New Zealand Film Commission and the ASB Community Trust, White Studio, Images and Sound, Heritage Hotels. Thank you all for coming. Please stay and have a slice of pizza on us. Get a drink. And most of all, thank you so much to Toa, Leanne and Matthew. Thank you.